USAID and ResilienceLinks, I welcome you to Progress on the Call to Prepare. I am Shantice McCorkle with ResilienceLinks. Before we begin, I'll orient you to the Blue Jeans platform. On the right side of the screen, you'll see most of your controls. First, if you haven't done so already, please use the chat to introduce yourself. To ask questions throughout the webinar, use the Q&A button on the bottom right. Please remember to indicate which presenter your question is for. If the presentation is too small on your screen, you can use the slide bar at the bottom of the window to adjust your view. Lastly, we are recording this webinar and will email you the post-event resources following the event. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out ResilienceLinks.org. And on the next slide, you can see our agenda for today on your screen. We look forward to hearing from each of our speakers and thank you for your attendance today. I'll now pass it to Michael Coons of USAID for a short introduction.
Thank you, Shantice. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see such a good turnout today. I'd like to start out by saying that on behalf of USAID Center for Resilience, we really appreciate the ResilienceLinks platform. The webinars and newsletters on resilience themes are a great way to share knowledge and learn about how the growing community of practitioners are designing and implementing programs that strengthen resilience among households, communities, and systems. Some of you may be familiar with USAID's resilience policy, which aims to improve resilience by strengthening local capacity to manage through adversity and change without compromising future well-being. A core aspect of this policy is helping stakeholders identify sources of resilience to anticipate and mitigate shocks and stresses so that individuals can improve their well-being, escape poverty, and stay out of it. Private sector engagement is fundamental to strengthening market systems' sources of resilience. We're excited about the Prepare call to action because of its potential to leverage investments in key sectors. The objective is also reflected in USAID's strategy, climate strategy, and the Prepare action plan. Investments that enable people to prepare for and manage climate impacts can take many forms, including investments in supply chains and workforces, as well as innovative products and services. The general idea here, also reflected in USAID's private sector engagement policy, is based on the premise that market-based approaches are a more sustainable way to support communities in achieving development and humanitarian outcomes at scale. We're looking forward to today's discussion, and we appreciate the opportunity to learn about the growing body of evidence demonstrating how strengthening market systems can achieve and maintain well-being outcomes in the face of climate and other significant shocks and stresses that communities face. Thank you all to all of our speakers and everybody who helped make this webinar possible. And thanks again for everybody for joining today. I'll now hand it over to Lindsay Doyle. Thanks, Lindsay, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from around the world. My name is Lindsay Doyle. I'm an adaptation finance advisor and USAID Chief of Staff for Prepare, or the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. We're really excited to have you here. In 2021, Aram Tal and colleagues at the World Bank released a seminal study that explored the levels of private sector investment in climate adaptation. Long before this, climate mitigation practices had been translated into specific market-based industries, technologies, and approaches. They started out with significant support from governments worldwide in the form of subsidies, technical assistance, thought partnership, and more. Innovation and learning was also central to this process. Today, we have entire industries dedicated to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we lack this same type of engagement on adaptation. Paul and her team, and a number of others since then, have highlighted many of the barriers that inhibit companies, investors, and financial institutions from taking those same steps on climate adaptation. They also began to lay out tangible solutions. The barriers faced ranged from perceived high risk to low returns of adaptation investments, to a lack of a common picture of what adaptation investments really look like, and a lack of data available to inform companies about their level of exposure to climate risk and for investors to know where to place their bets. While there are certainly some fundamental differences between market uptake of mitigation versus adaptation, the Prepare call to action to the private sector is testing out those similarities. The overall goal of this call to action is to dramatically increase private investment and substantive corporate action on adaptation, to create shared value for communities that are most affected by climate change. Next slide, please. Within the US government, we're acknowledging these longstanding barriers and are inviting private entities to work with us to address them. The Prepare call to action was launched by USAID Administrator Samantha Power, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry, former National Economic Council Director Brian Deese, and Chief Climate Officer of the Development Finance Corporation Jake Levine at COP27 in Egypt this past November. This call aims to galvanize voluntary company commitments that improve climate resilience for both consumers and communities experiencing climate impacts firsthand. Combined with the US government's work to both de-risk adaptation investments and spur innovation, this complementary call to action invites companies to make a commitment in a number of different ways. They include either investing in the resilience of their own supply chain and workforce, to innovate on new products or efficiency gains that are needed to adapt to a warming world, deploy products or services that enable people to prepare for and manage climate impacts, or to invest their own funds in market-based adaptation projects. Next slide, please. 10 companies initially heeded this call. 3 of those companies are represented on our webinar today, including Google, WTW, and Marsh McLennan. Next slide. Here we have a summary of the 10 commitments, and I'll just briefly run through these. Google committed to expanding coverage for flood early warning beyond the work it was doing in the US to 18 new countries, including 15 in Africa. Marsh McLennan co-launched a new insurance and adaptation mobilization campaign and is exploring how to standardize the way that the insurance industry quantifies their impact on climate risk reduction. MasterCard committed to developing new financial technology solutions for adaptation and expanding access to an existing product, their Community Pass, for climate-related decision support for farmers. Next slide. Microsoft expanded their AI for Good research lab for the first time in Africa and is convening a related council on this issue. WTW committed to engaging with UNDRR and the Insurance Development Forum to develop the Global Resilience Index Initiative, which you'll hear more about shortly. Grow Intelligence is exploring the application of climate information services in their line of agricultural analytics products. Next slide. And for the final 4 commitments, Meta committed to integrating climate risk assessments into their business operations and expanding some of their core products, such as their post-disaster alerts, to serve anticipatory functions. Pegasus Capital Advisors committed to mobilizing $500 million toward adaptation. PepsiCo pledged to double down on their work on water conservation in irrigation for their agricultural supply chains. And SAP committed to develop digital tools to help with adaptation and preparedness in affected communities. Transparency of the implementation process of this call to action is really critical for the US government, for our civil society partners, and most importantly, for the communities who stand to benefit from this work. This webinar represents one of several ways we are seeking to enable the public to track and engage with this call to action. Next slide. With this, I will introduce our program for today. We will have 3 presentations from the companies that have responded to the call to action to share updates on their progress since COP27. This will be followed by a response from a representative from Starbucks, as well as USAID's Advisory Council on Voluntary Foreign Assistance, working group on private sector engagement. We'll then open it up to discussion with the audience, and we'll invite you to use the Q&A function on the right side to share your questions over the course of the webinar. We will capture all those questions and aim to pose as many as possible to the panelists. I'll now introduce our first speaker. From Marsh McLennan, we are joined by Frances Bouchard, Managing Director for Climate. Frances leads the team's climate strategy and for developing and delivering solutions from across Marsh McLennan that help clients create resilient strategies for the future. Welcome, Frances. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate the invitation, appreciate being part of the initiative. And if we can go to the slide, you'll see that what was referenced earlier, this is where we're co-leading this effort. This is a massive effort across the insurance sector. So we're certainly not the only company participating. In fact, the Willis representative in a few minutes will touch on a critical element of this. I also like to say that, the insurance industry has inherently always been part of adaptation to different risks, and risk reduction has been a core element of the insurance mechanism since its beginning, really. What's different is that there's a growing recognition that individual building by building by building resilience is simply not going to be enough in the face of the sheer scale and breadth of climate exposures. So we're really looking to engage more at the system level, and that's really what this initiative is all about. And it really started last year in a dialogue we had with the high-level champions for the UN Climate Change high-level champions in their Race to Resilience initiative. We started talking about how could we really start to organize the insurance sector and apply the collective capabilities that the sector has on these topics, perhaps more consciously and, again, at the system level as opposed to the individual property level. And that really led to a dialogue in Sharm el-Sheikh with a number of industry leaders that then precipitated the release of the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, which included some finance or 3 cross-cutting finance objectives, and for the first time, the insurance sector was explicitly referenced alongside public finance as well as private finance as a key element. And what you'll see on the slide here is kind of the oversight of, or the high-level objectives of what was agreed would be this call to action and where we would try to drive industry impact by 2030. And that is really in 3 particular areas. One is to promote projects. So in the report that we launched prior to the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda being released, we highlighted 17 pioneer projects where insurance is being utilized to really advance and enable the concept of risk reduction and adaptation. And most of those were in the developing world. And since then, we're gonna try to triple down for COP28 and identify 50 of these new projects. And these projects range from extreme heat microinsurance programs to nature-based solutions at a watershed level. A lot of growing focus on wildfire mitigation as well. There are novel new models of insurance, whether it's from an anticipatory perspective or utilizing community-based efficiencies or new approaches like parametrics and whatnot. So there's an incredible amount of innovation and new thinking around how we can apply the insurance mechanism and the capabilities of that mechanism to really advance projects on the ground across the world. And that will be a major part of this effort going forward. A second one is really around frameworks, and you're going to hear my industry colleagues speak to one of these initiatives in a bit here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the Insurance Development Forum really has been a leading thinker in terms of how to advance the insurance sector's role in a lot of these topics, and that includes here this concept of how do we measure the benefits of adaptation? How do we kind of come up with that 1.5 equivalent? When you say 1.5 on the mitigation side, everybody knows what it is. But there's also a lack of consistency around how we talk about our capabilities and how we apply them and measure them. So we're looking at how to standardize some of those elements as well, so that we could set could develop a better sense of how the industry is impacting climate adaptation around the world, and perhaps over time even set targets for doing that. And the third area is really to explore how we can institutionalize solutions. This is where we will scale. The projects are, one project at a time. The institutional solutions are really the scaling mechanisms to replicate those en masse across the board. In those, there's a series of conversations going on, not only within the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF, but in a number of other places as well around, what type of capabilities are needed to do that? What would the focus be? Do we already have multiple efforts looking at similar content areas as well as similar users and target audiences? Are there pieces of policy or legislation that we could be promoting that would also be enabling that? So there's across the board activity. What is developing here, and for those of you who have driven industry level initiatives will appreciate this. There's a bit of a tailoring by geography. So what the Latin America or African industry may be promoting or thinking about doing would be a little different than what the Europeans or Americans are. So each of these are reflected somewhat differently by geography, but the positive thing is that there's progress on each of them. The last piece I want to highlight here, and I know that the focus is primarily on the developing world here on this call, but for those of you who engage in the United States on some of these same topics, there's a piece of legislation that was actually enacted, meaning signed into law last December with very little fanfare, but it really could be transformational in terms of prioritizing social vulnerability as part of as a balancing act to the physical exposure on climate issues. So it's called the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act. And what it's really intended to do is to use not just risk data from the National Risk Index, but social vulnerability metrics as well, to identify those communities that are most at risk and most in need. And it could be transformational from a prioritization perspective, but it could also serve as a model for perhaps other funding mechanisms that really take into account a much more holistic set of factors when prioritizing adaptation investment decisions. So I think with that, Lindsay, I'll leave it to the questions, and back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francis. And I think a great point in terms of the public and private interplay and what we need on the regulatory side as well. With that, I will turn it next to Mariah Royce. Mariah is a senior product manager with Google and a leader on their flood forecasting tool. Mariah brings over 10 years of experience in managing the full cycle of product delivery. And we're very excited to hear your update. So Mariah, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, hello everyone. Excited to be here. As I was presented, I'm a product manager within the research team in Google. I work mostly on flood forecasting and wildfire detection, but working in a big team that is doing very similar things on other climate change disasters. Can we go to next slide, please? These are just part of the projects that we're working on. So floods and wildfires are in a very advanced stage. We also do what we call green light, which is optimizing traffic lights to reduce emission. Sky is post-disaster damage assessment in the level of building. We do some research on earthquake modeling. Open building datasets is a way to identify specific buildings, and we added them all to Google Maps, but it's also available dataset out there. We also do some research around locust and food security. And we're also working on new directions like global development, agriculture and food security, climate sustainability, and disaster management. Today, I will focus specifically on the flood forecasting and the expansion that we did. Can we go next slide, please? So just in a nutshell, what's the Google Flood Forecasting project is. We have two types of machine learning models. All our models are based on machine learning, unlike the common modeling of the hydrologic world that exists out there. Our first model is the hydrologic model, which identify the level of the water in a specific location at the river. This is very similar to hydrologic models that are out there, but using machine learning allow us to scale fast to many more locations on the river and to many more countries, and we will look at that in a minute. The next model that we have is the inundation model, where given the location, the water level on a specific location at the river, we can identify how the water are going to spread and which villages and which cities they are going to reach. Those two models are specifically for riverine floods, and this is what those are the types of floods that we are focused. The inundation model allows us to generate maps of inundation, so you can see actually what are the areas that are covered with water and what are not. The third component of our model is to provide this information, both the hydrology forecast and the inundation forecast, over Google Maps, Google Search, and over the Flood Hub, which is an internal tool that provides all the information we have on floods. And you can see here some screenshots. The left screenshot is from the Flood Hub, which I'll show you in a minute, the web address. And on the right is actually an actual flood alert that we can see on Google Search. From Google Search, we also send notifications to users who are located specifically on places that we identify as flooded. We send push notifications from their Android phones to their Android phones, and once they click on the notification, they get to the alert over search. Next slide, please. So this is us at one of the villages in India that was flooded, and we visited there last September. We utilized the model that we had specifically in India, the machine learning model. We utilized it with some global weather and precipitation data sets, and we allowed it to grow globally. We are now covering 50 countries, a total of 1,200 stations. And I'm happy to say that next week we're going to cover 80 countries, a total of 1,800 stations, which we will cover 23 countries specifically in Africa. And everyone who wants to see this information, you can go to c.co/floodhub. All the flood information that we have there, is available there. And we are also working with NGOs and organizations that are locally located in order to provide this information to the locals, either to do it by last mile delivery or by cash transfers operations and so forth. Next slide, please. So this is the map of the Flood Hub. All the areas that are in green, yellow, or red, or gray are the areas that we have flood alerts models at. We have different models, different situations, but all this information is available for everyone. And on the right, you can see a mobile screenshot where we show both the map of the area. The blue represents a flooded area. And at the bottom, we show a hydrograph that shows how the water are going to change along the time, related to danger level and warning level that represent return year period. The red and the yellow represent alerts, actual alerts, and when you go in, you can see the map and the information about the river level at this location. We are working to grow to more areas, and as I said, next week we will show much more on the map. Next slide. Just a general statement, Google is committed to constantly look for ways to advance climate resilience, both on adaptations and mitigation. And our main goal as the Google goal is to empower others to do the same. Our users is everyone around the world, and we would like to provide them also climate change information, just as we provide all other information over the Google products. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar.
Thank you so much, Mariah. Great to hear the details of the tool itself and understand a bit about the expansion that's planned too. Now I'd like to introduce Matthew Foote. Matthew Foote is a Senior Director of Science and Analytics in the Climate and Resilience Hub at WTW, formerly known as Willis Towers Watson. PUT focuses on integrating climate information into the risk management and decision-making systems of both public and private sector financial institutions. So Matthew, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. First of all, it's an absolute pleasure, like everybody, to be involved in this important event. And also, we're honoured to be a member and partner of the Prepare group and its call to action. And so it's an absolute pleasure to be here to describe something that's already been raised by both Michael and Lindsay, but then also we've heard also from others on the calls here about the importance, I think, of not only creating resilience to climate risk, but also being able to understand, assess, and then communicate the material priorities that countries increasingly have to deal with in a rapidly evolving risk environment. And obviously, many countries around the world, this is a major challenge because of a particular issue, which is the data gap that exists in being able to assess and then quantify the relative level of physical risk and therefore the potential benefits of resilience measures, both physical or organisational, but then also in risk transfer and capital provision as well. And so we're a member, as Francis has already said, of a public-private organisation called the Insurance Development Forum, the IDF. The IDF brings together the insurance industry plus a number of public sector bodies, including the UNDRR, the UNDP, the World Bank, and a number of international specialist groups formed to assess and encourage resilience in infrastructure and investment around the world to encourage that resilience to be put in place in the most effective and equitable ways. As I said, a major challenge of that is actually in being able to provide the underlying evidence basis to allow for consistent, transparent, open and trusted understanding of the relative risks that countries face now and in the future to climate-related perils and hazards. The insurance industry and the Insurance Development Forum answered another call to action that was set by Mark Carney in his role as the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change in 2020 to create the data products and the expertise that the insurance industry uses on a daily basis around risk and resilience into products and data sets that could be provided and used by stakeholders across the world at a level that allowed for a consistent assessment of relative risk and then into obviously the high level strategies that should be put in place. And so the IDF brought its technical teams together, including WTW, to build the Global Resilience Index and the initiative around it. The GRI is a data model and associated platform which has been developed to provide the trusted baseline source of open access modelling and reference data, which can be applied by global stakeholders at different levels, both sovereign and sub-sovereign, to assess and then approach the needs of the quantification of physical impacts to climate change across every country in the world. And to this end, the GRI is developing and creating a new climate conditioned hazard and risk database, which will provide those core metrics and the risk indices, which have open ability to be used by countries and those stakeholders who require that type of information. And as a founding member of the IDF and a member of the task force, WTW has committed to providing both technical input and support to the GRI, but also funding and convening of the workshops that are needed to bring the key partners, the technical partners around the industry and more on the public-private sector side, to build this open access database and provide the curation and delivery of it in the most effective way. At COP27, we launched the first version of the GRI, including a stakeholder assessment, because obviously, as well as building data models, these have to be usable and aligned to the stakeholder needs as much as possible around its key areas of humanitarian, disaster risk financing and disaster risk management, and particularly in the countries of need and use. And so the stakeholder assessment was a key part of COP27. Unlike standard risk indices, the GRI uses both an asset level and a subnational approach, which is fully transparent, fully open, very important, based on the insurance industry's catastrophe risk modelling expertise and approaches, but then coupled with best-in-class environmental science and engineering. And it takes a people, planet and prosperity approach, which includes data and models of nature, biodiversity and social vulnerability factors, alongside infrastructure, economic activity and economic systems. Next slide, please. So it's been developed to provide a whole range of key aspects that can be used by countries and stakeholders in those countries to give transparency, to give confidence around consistent and comparable views of risk and the quantification of risk across a different range of indices, and then to provide the underlying models and methodologies in an open way to provide the most important understanding and the ability to assess and utilize this information and interpret its outputs in the most effective way. And it is effectively a public good, open to all database, which will be made available to all who need it. Next slide, please. As said, COP27 was the first launch of the pilot. We are now in the phase of developing the fully functional platform to curate and maintain the index and its associated modelling on an open access basis for future use by every stakeholder requiring it. This is an ambitious exercise, as you can imagine. It's intended to drive not only a collective data set, but also a community of stakeholders and end users who will further develop this into more effective means and to grow its capabilities over time. And its success will be seen in its ability to provide those metrics and indices at a level of resolution and consistency, which will be used by all those stakeholders to mainstream ongoing risk measurement and to provide the evidence base needed to quantify the benefits of increased investment in the most material risks and physical aspects needed to be assessed by different countries. And in addition, very important thing to see the GRI as a complement to other initiatives, particularly those by the IDF, and in particular something called the Global Risk Modelling Alliance, the GRMA, which is a complementary initiative which being led by the IDF to develop a technical and analytical capacity in country at a higher resolution for the assessment and quantification of specific risk management and financing solutions, to take it to the level where it can be applied to transactional needs for risk financing. This is funded by the German government and was proposed by the key V20 members. And as I said, the GRI is intended to complement at the higher level the ability to then use the GRI to assess and structure the strategic goals of initiatives like the GRMA to be as effective as possible in country and to help define those most effective approaches. So in summary, again, the GRI is meant to be a globally consistent open access data model designed and developed by the insurance industry in conjunction with its public sector partners, but owned by its stakeholders. This is a very, very early start in its program, but it's a very exciting initiative, and we welcome all stakeholders and those interested to contribute. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I think this tool, will go a long way to help addressing those data gaps and also really helping countries respond to the UN Secretary General's call for early warning for all, which is part of PREPARE in terms of the US effort related to that. So now I will turn it to our last speaker, Megan Debates. Megan Debates is the Government Affairs and Policy Advisor with Starbucks. Although Starbucks is not yet in the call to action, and we look forward to seeing them become part of it, then a key kind of partner for us in this work is also the USAID's Advisory Council on Voluntary Foreign Assistance. And so Megan is representing that institution as well. Megan has more than 15 years of experience in a range of roles from the US Congress, as well as trade associations for organic products. So I will turn it now to Megan.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how Starbucks is approaching mitigation and adaptation and highlight some of the key initiatives and projects that further illustrate our approach. But I'll start out by talking about our role on USAID's Advisory Committee for Voluntary Foreign Aid. So we joined this last year, and we serve on 2 working groups as part of the committee, the working group on climate change and food security and the private sector engagement working group. So we joined this committee because we source from nearly 500,000 smallholder farms in over 30 countries. So as a company, we've partnered a lot with USAID on many projects and put forward investments in the origin countries where coffee is grown. So we have shared goals with USAID in ensuring that the coffee growing communities that we work with are resilient, healthy, and thriving. And the committee will be providing recommendations on modernizing public-private sector partnerships and development and making large-scale investments. So with climate, the challenges that we face are too large for any one company like ours to make an impact. So we are looking at more and more towards collective action and partnerships to make longer-term, bigger investments. So that's going to require more strategic, effective collective action in order to move the needle. So that's sort of the work of the committee is modernizing how USAID engages with the private sector. So we're really proud to be a part of that. So overall, on our approach to mitigation and adaptation, so our mitigation strategy as a very large company is really focused on carbon, water, and waste reduction. So reducing our carbon, water, and waste by 50% by 2030. And sustainable agriculture is a huge part of that as a food and beverage company. So I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing with farmers. And then for adaptation, we're more looking at ecosystem and climate resiliency. So looking at taking a whole systems approach and looking at making large scale watershed and landscape investments. And with both of these strategies, along the way, it's important for us, we have to engage and bring communities along with us and change behavior over the long term. So our primary focus when it comes to mitigation, our agricultural supply chain is our largest source of emissions. So we're really investing there. We always have with our cafe coffee practice standards, which include sustainable land use practices. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So it starts with our farmers. We have 10 farmer support centers around the world in coffee growing regions. And these farmer support centers really are a one-stop shop for farmers. So we provide coffee farmers with fertilizer, with seedlings, with infrastructure, and also with knowledge. So we have agronomists that provide technical assistance to help them adapt and adopt more regenerative agricultural practices. We also provide loans to help them diversify their income outside of coffee and diversify their farms, and infrastructure for their farms that's more sustainable. And the great thing about our agronomy program is that it's open source. So farmers can access it regardless of whether or not they supply to Starbucks. And I would say like a key kind of strategy around this knowledge transfer on sustainable practices is there's 3 key ways we accomplish this. We have a train the trainer model. So how do farmers get their knowledge to adopt better practices? A lot of times it's from local agronomists or crop consultants. Our agronomists train those that will then go out in the field, and that kind of amplifies the adoption. And then we also have model farms in each region. And so the model farms are really the best in class on sustainable practices. And the farmers that own these model farms typically are leaders in their community. So that farmer to farmer knowledge transfer is important too. So farmers can go and see what's happening on these farms and work with the farmer that owns that farm and train themselves to adopt better practices. And then we directly work one-on-one with farmers. We've trained more than 25,000 farmers last year. And then we're making additional on-farm investments. So helping farmers use less fertilizer, use greener fertilizer. We've made a commitment to replant 100 million coffee trees. So we're giving away coffee trees to coffee farmers, varietals that we've developed that are rust-resistant coffee trees. So coffee rust is one of the primary diseases that's impacting coffee growing communities right now. So we're trying to adapt better seedlings and varietals that can withstand climate change. And then on the water side, coffee is a very water intensive process. So it's done through wet mills, the coffee processing, and we've developed technology of dry mills, what we call eco mills, and those eco mills have reduced the water used in coffee processing by 80%. So we're trying to deploy that infrastructure out to coffee growing communities. Next slide, please. So these are some of the key initiatives that we've invested in. And from an adaptation perspective, we're really looking at large-scale landscape investments. So we're working with other industry actors and local communities in the public sector to make broader-based landscape investments longer term. So we're looking at the entire ecosystem. So where before we might have just invested in individual projects on water, now we're looking at the entire watershed and investing in projects that protect that entire watershed. And we're looking at restoring forest landscapes in coffee growing communities through agroforestry. And then we're also investing in research and development. So adapting to what coffee is going to look like in the future, who's going to grow it, and where is it going to be grown. So those are just a few examples of the work that we're doing. And we're really looking to work with USAID and other partners to help scale these investments. That I'm going to hand it back over to Lindsay for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And really important to hear about the work Starbucks is doing, especially to support smallholder farmers and leaders in many of the communities that I know those on the line care quite a lot about. So now we're going to move into the moderated question and answer period, and we've had a number of great questions added to the chat and Q&A function. I invite everyone who's listening and heard the presentations to share their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll continue to work our way through those. For the discussion portion of our webinar, we will also be inviting 2 additional panelists. I'll invite Pallavi Sherakar, who's an adaptation advisor with the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the State Department, to join us, as well as Nate Matthews, who is the CEO of the Global Resilience Partnership, which is USAID's implementing partner for the Prepare call to action and a key partner with us in this work. So I will invite now all of our panelists to come on camera, and we can get started with some of the questions that have come through. I see colleagues coming online. If you could just turn your camera on for the discussion, that would be great. All right. Well, Matthew, I see you on camera there, so I might start off with you in terms of a question related to the GRII. It seems like it has quite a few capabilities and sort of this effort to really get high resolution data as well. Could you talk a little bit about some of the different use cases that you see for this particular tool?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Absolutely. As mentioned, the GRI is intended to provide a trusted central data source to create a range of indices and associated risk assessment tools, which can be used by a whole range of stakeholders. I mentioned that actually a large part of the last year's work of the GRI team, the task force, has been to do the stakeholder assessments to map the particular needs identified for different stakeholder groups across development space, particularly in not only in the financing side, but actually in a more humanitarian sense as well, to try and understand how we can best then align the GRI's design and the initial data products to be most effective. And some of the use cases and the test cases that we've identified include obviously things around general climate stress testing. We know that there's still a big challenge, for instance, in being able to look at different scales of physical, climate, financial risk and nature-related financial risks at an appropriate and consistent level, just by understanding where the stresses may be now and in the future. And so there's an intent for the tool to do that. There's also then, as you could probably imagine, given its provenance around the insurance development forum, the insurance industry, as both Francis and I have mentioned, is that there is clearly a way to utilise it potentially to help, at least at the highest level, assess the strategic needs for risk financing at a sovereign level, for instance, in providing disaster risk financing capabilities and optimising them, but at a certain level. And very importantly then, that would then feed, as I said, into things like the Global Risk Modelling Alliances Initiative to then refine and make more detail, and very importantly to provide the ownership of that risk understanding and the optimisation in country. So a big part of both the GRI and the GRMA projects is to provide the capacity building elements as well as the data and the modelling to allow countries to have a more effective way to manage and understand risk and then to communicate it to its own stakeholders. And lastly, I'd say, there's obviously the thing that everybody's getting involved in across the world now, which is being able to disclose climate risk, whether it's for financing as asset owners or managers or others. And that's becoming an increasingly important part for countries and sovereigns as regulation starts to align to that. And so the GRI can be obviously used in that way as well. The last thing I'd say is it's actually a growing and evolving data product, and there are many potential uses, and we really do want stakeholders to help define and own the product. It shouldn't be an imposed view, it should be an owned platform. We need to start somewhere, but it's meant to evolve, and so it's got many potential uses. We're starting with these.
Thanks so much. And I see this also relates to a question that Eric Hauxton from USTDA, who's also part of Prepare, asked, just in terms of how infrastructure project developers can use data developed by GRII as well. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add on that.
Very much what I've said, but obviously with the other partners in the task force, including the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, this idea of particularly systemic and infrastructure risk being connectable. One of the things that the GRI is trying to do is to frame infrastructure risk in every sense in ways that make as much of the connections to the gross patterns that are in infrastructure, both spatially and temporally, so that better solutions can be set to build resilience at the start into projects that will then have long-term implications. And so, yes, indeed, that short answer is yes, actually, but we welcome more engagement.
Great. I saw a question come in for Mariah on Google, and Mariah wanted to see if you're still with us as well. Right, circle back to.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great.
Sorry, I'm here. Yeah. Sorry.
No worries. We have a question for you. Curious to know if Google has any initiative on drought and flood in the Horn of Africa, specifically around drought modeling in Somalia, and how can responding organizations like IRC, International Rescue Committee, partner with you in these locations?
We did look into droughts. We don't have a full solution, but it's definitely on our radar. So again, it's also connected to food security, which is something that we're looking into. So if there is any potential idea that we can collaborate on, that remote sensing can help or AI can help, we would love to hear about that, and feel free to reach out to me about that. We are already in connection with IRC. There's a project was done last August on the Benue River, when IRC provided cash transfers to villages there. I think it was 750 households. We weren't able to provide forecast then, but we've met them again, and we hopefully will provide them forecast in the next season. So feel free to connect through IRC or directly to me, and we would love to hear what are the options there.
Great. It sounds like budding partnerships as well. So Megan, a question came in for Starbucks in terms of whether Starbucks is contributing to USAID's Feed the Future for Development Finance Fund as a mechanism to fund projects to scale climate smart agriculture and conservation efforts. And a congratulations on the reduction, on the 80% water use reduction as well.
Yeah, so we have worked with USAID in the past and made some contributions for conservation projects within our coffee growing communities, although I'm not quite sure if we've contributed that fund in particular, but I can certainly find out and get back to you.
So there's a question I'd like to pose to the full panel here in terms of, this also comes from Eric, and I think it was a question we wanted to make sure we covered around what government agencies can do to further support private sector action to enhance resilience. And this, I think in USTDA's case, is very much related to infrastructure, but I know that the work that you all have touched on today covers all of the different focus areas within Prepare. So I don't know, Francis, would you like to start us off on that and welcome responses from others on the panel?
Yeah, I'll start, Lindsay, just because I touched on it with my slide. And I'd say, first of all, government has to be integral to these solutions, because they're the ones who are going to set kind of the framework. And without a framework, it's kind of ad hoc activity, and that's certainly not going to achieve kind of a holistic plan. Take a watershed, for example. If there isn't an understanding of the watershed exposure, you just go in and do individual projects, there might actually be maladaptation. So, in addition to kind of understanding and driving that holistic plan, there's an incredible need for resilience or adaptation funding for really three reasons, I'd say. One is, the mitigation funding, you can raise that globally. And you saw the $100 trillion kind of launch at COP26. But adaptation is local, right? So there's really a very inherently different dimension to the funding and where it goes between mitigation and adaptation. I'd also say that, the beneficiaries on the mitigation side, there's kind of the entire globe benefits from the investments that are made on the mitigation side. On the adaptation front, it's individuals. It's the human beings who are exposed to the physical exposure here. And that's a very different calculus when it comes to finding in private funding sources, when the benefits really accrue to individuals that may not be associated with the funding. And the last bit I'd say is that when on the mitigation front, the returns are pretty clear. You can invest in a technology or whatnot, and it might become that technology, and you could really reap a significant financial benefit. It's harder to see that when your goal is for something not to happen, right? The event not to happen, in the human carnage or the human impact or the economic impact to not happen. So all of that suggests that the role of government should be to really look at how to incentivize private sector investment in more of these. And the reference to the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act in my slide was a teaser at that, because the first round of the legislation that has been enacted does not include a financial incentive, but the promoters of the legislation are already working on a second phase that would then facilitate a tax credit of sort, or a resilience bond, or some type of private sector catalyst within these disaster zones. So it's a good example of attaching a financing private sector crowdsourcing capability into a very prioritized set of a framework, right? So they're saying we want to prioritize highly socially vulnerable communities that have climate risk exposure. And then you add to that a mechanism that would actually draw in private sector investment. And that's a wonderful kind of combination of government role here. It's not to set the terms of all of the interventions that are going to be made, but to create that kind of mechanism that would draw in private sector and then prioritize the incentives on those communities that need it most.
Do others on the panel want to come in on this question of the role of government in incentivizing? I see Matt, your hand's up.
Yeah. I mean, just to add to Lindsay's very comprehensively, I mean, from personal experience, I think government agencies need to work together as well. One of the things that I learned in a number of guises was that you've got to put together the framework from end to end to enable effective risk management and risk financing to operate, particularly in countries where those things haven't been set up in the past. One of the things, the lessons learned, I think, from many projects that I've known about is they need to have the right legislation in place as well. So, it starts from having the laws, the decrees and everything set to enable the optimal approach and then bringing it through. So having champions in different agencies to support a collective goal, I think, is very important. Those key stakeholder organisations working in concert is a very important aspect, and I think that is quite common, across the world in different countries. Again, having the right data and the things that enable that consensus to be built, we think is critical. But I agree, government agencies have a really critical role to enabling successful applications at every level.
That's great. I don't know, Megan or Nate or Pallavi, if you'd be interested in coming in on that question. We've also got a related question on kind of the facilitative role that Prepare is playing as well. So wanted to give you a chance to come in on that if you'd like.
Sure, I guess I would agree with what others have said. We need co-investment and also good policy that can help facilitate and support the work that the private sector is doing on climate resiliency and adaptation.
I might turn to Glenn. Glenn's question, which is very much related to this. Has Prepare or its partners acted as a facilitator? For example, there seems to be potential for collaboration between the efforts of Google Flood Hub, the WTW Early Warning Tool, and USAID's activities like FuseNet. How could partners see Prepare moving the needle on collaboration? I don't know if Nate or Pallavi would want to jump in first on that question.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm happy to jump in first. And hi, everyone. Really, really glad that you're all here. I think that one of the reasons we launched the Prepare call to action was very much with the idea of this type of coordination in mind. When we talk about the importance of accelerating adaptation action, when we launched the Prepare call to action, it was with a clear understanding that public policy, public action, public finance is absolutely critical and is not replaced by private action, but rather those two pieces can work well together to actually realize the scale that we need. And so one of the ways, and I think Glenn's question relates to this quite clearly, is in the climate information services and data space. So just maybe as a broader US government example, when the UN Secretary General launched his call for early warning for all in the next 5 years to protect the world in early warning systems. We were really excited by that, and we really wanted to lean in on that. And we've, in the past year, announced over $40 million to help support that vision. But a lot of our funding is going towards making sure that the world's covered with systematic observations and that we're actually building those early warning systems. But it's not enough to just build those systems, right? We need to actually be able to do last mile delivery. We need to be able to understand that information. And that's really where I think some of the conversation on GRI or Google's flood forecasting work really comes into play. Is there's complementary elements to this. And I think that one of the spaces where you're really starting to see that pick up is in the climate information services and early warning space. And that's definitely what we intend to build this Prepare call to action to do across multiple sectors and across multiple areas. And maybe I'll turn it to Nate from the Global Resilience Partnership to talk specifically about their role and how they're helping to coordinate in the context of the call to action. Thanks.
Thanks, Pallavi, and yeah, equally excited to be on this call with everyone here. I think it's a great question. I think there's real opportunity to be seeing where these companies' value chains converge and where we can bridge the respective strengths of their resilience and adaptation investments in specific locales and regions. be that in Africa or South Asia or in other areas where there's real need to see that convergence and ensure that they add up to more than the sum of their parts. And there's a real willingness we're already seeing across the companies involved in the call to action to work together. And to touch a bit on Francis's point around context and really focusing on the individual here, I think GRP's, one of the strengths that we bring is our connection as founding signatories of the locally led adaptation principles, and the locally led adaptation community of practice is really understanding that context from local communities and working with our partners that we've had a trusted relationship with for almost 10 years now on the ground to understand where resilience, what their resilience challenges are and how we can bring that into those companies' investments. And also the science component as well. So really seeing the opportunity on the science, on the latest adaptation and resilience science, that we work with some great scientists across this space. And then finally, and I think this gets to one of the other questions, is around the measurement, and also Francis's challenge, here that he mentioned about how do we measure, and measuring the counterfactual is often difficult. And so it's really understanding the advances in resilience measurement and evidence that's out there as well. And I'd also use this opportunity to plug an event that we're running in June, the Resilience Evidence Forum. I'll put something in the chat, but it's June 20th to the 22nd, hosted by USAID and GRP, on bringing together an interactive gathering that will take stock of the latest evidence on resilience and its implications for policy and programming. So I'll pop that into the chat for everyone. But yeah, I think there's some really exciting opportunities within the call to action to bring us together and really push the needle and advance things on adaptation resilience. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pallavi and Nate. And I think definitely a key part of the work in terms of this multi-sector engagement is absolutely what we're looking to see within Prepare, and then more specifically, the call to action. I wanted to turn next to Matthew and potentially for Francis as well on a question related to tools and methodologies from the insurance sector. And the question is, are there any tools or methodologies that the insurance sector uses that could be adapted to improve how USAID programs and partners are able to quickly and accurately report on the adaptation impacts of their activities?
Yeah, I could start and let Francis obviously add as well. No, I think there are many examples, and I think it's pretty clear from what Francis was saying, and I hope from the work we're doing with the IDF collectively, that there is a real opportunity, I think, to deploy and use the methods and approaches that are used daily by the insurance industry in the right ways to both quantify and then evidence, as we just heard from Nathaniel, the impact and potential benefits of adding resilience into adaptation strategies when we've got the right level of data. And it's always about the data for me, and making sure that the data that is available is appropriate. One of the reasons to have the GRI is to have that consistent view of the key high-level aspects. One thing that's been brought up a couple of times already is the importance of geospatial data. And I think this is a big area that the insurance industry has a lot of experience in, which can be deployed in many ways to both quantify, but also then monitor, very importantly, change. And if we look at some of the work, for instance, at the Intergovernmental Panel on Earth Observation, GEO is doing at country levels, some of the work there on disaster risk management, on climate change, is to try and utilize the same methods and data the insurance industry is doing, but more widely to the application of that to resilience monitoring. And I think, again, this is a very rapidly evolving space. The insurance industry, as we said through the IDF, is very keen to work on a public good basis with public-private partnerships to leverage those techniques and the models in the most appropriate ways. But yeah, there's a whole range of techniques and data, particularly catastrophe risk, but in others as well.
The only thing I would add, I would echo and agree with everything Matt has said, but I would add that the technology is not yet there to be able to say, look, in 10 years, this individual home is likely to have this impact. We can look at the longer term forecast and modeling and see, trends, certainly trends. We can see, kind of where we expect risk to increase from a geographic perspective for sure. But we have yet to be able to kind of take that and apply it to the individual building or structure, whatnot, right? So there's often a question, or the insurance industry is asked, okay, well, can't you just provide a discount, for this activity or that activity? And, for a product that is sold in 12-month increments, it becomes quite difficult to kind of capture a 10 or 15 year kind of manifestation of risk into a 12-month instrument, right? So I agree with everything that's been said around kind of the application of the analytics and the tools and whatnot, but just a bit of warning that we're not there yet where we can kind of connect, what we expect to happen in 10 years to, an individual policy or an individual homeowner or business or government. It's just we're not there yet with that level of specifics. So I don't know if we'll ever get there, but certainly you see a lot of investment in that, not only in the insurance sector, but the entire financial sector as well. So I just want to kind of throw a bit of a caveat out there in terms of the specificity of our ability to kind of model what I think was behind the question.
That's really helpful to understand kind of where some of those capabilities are and kind of state of play there. One question that I wanted to pose to the group and anyone who's sort of willing to jump in on it is around sort of the biggest challenges that you see for your respective industries. So sort of looking beyond your own company, but looking at particular industries. I think we've heard a bit in terms of some of the kind of capabilities and where that is growing in the insurance industry, but I think could apply across sort of what are the biggest challenges that you see in your respective industries as it relates to climate impacts, and sort of a related question around, as climate risk information becomes more available, there is this potential risk of divestment as more information becomes available, as well as the potential for greater investment. And thinking about how you foresee either clients or consumers making use of that information and how that might affect communities that are impacted by climate change.
Hey, Lindsay, Francis here. There's a lot to unpack in that question, and we could have an entire panel on either the first part of your question or the second part of your question, right? So, but to pick up on the challenges, I'm going to say something that might seem a little counter to what we've been discussing here, but I think the biggest challenge for the insurance sector is to be able to think past risk transfer. Our core economic role is to provide a mechanism to transfer risk. But I think in the climate sense, that will be part of our solution. But as I think Matt has articulated extremely well here, we have analytical capabilities, and we have other tools that we can use beyond the risk transfer that will be critical to put in the hands of the people who really need to make these tough decisions about where to invest, how to invest, and how to protect our communities. So I think from the insurance industry's perspective, the biggest challenge will be to think past risk transfer and to understand the other ways that we can help here. And we've done this in the past. I mean, when electricity was rolled out in the late 1800s, the insurance industry didn't go and kind of run to risk transfer mechanisms. It created Underwriters Laboratory from a safety perspective, right? So, but it used the same analytical tools it does to underwrite a policy to actually create a safety approach to a new technology of electricity. We did the same thing with cars and whatnot. So the insurance industry has a history of thinking past transfer, and I just hope we could do that again here.
Thanks, Francis. Does anyone else want to come in on that question of kind of biggest challenges facing your industry as it relates to climate impacts?
Well, I think the food and beverage industry, you know, farmers are on the front lines of climate change, and they're going to have to completely change the way that they grow food and how they do that, and have the knowledge to do that, and the resources to adopt more sustainable practices are really expensive. And so if we're not making investments to help farmers make that transition, it's going to be very difficult for them to survive that. And, you know, they're already operating on thin margins and losing crops to drought and extreme weather events. So there just needs to be more private sector and public sector support for farmers to help them get through that transition.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. We got a question from Amy at Planet. How do you think large language models applied to spatial data will affect makeup, use, and standardization of climate risk indices in the next few years? Would WTW or Marsh want to come in on that?
I could start. I think increasingly with the scale and the complexity of the data models that are going to be applied, particularly in the spatial context, I think the use of large-scale language-based models will become more important, obviously. I think there are risks, personally, in the use of automated, semi-automated approaches. I mean, image processors, I mean, my background is in image processing and satellite imagery, used image processing techniques, which are pretty much the old school machine learning approaches to characterize and classify images, right? It's an old, well often used technology in spatial data, but it's about evidencing it, I think, and making sure that the patterns that you see are ones that you would understand. And I think this is something that, yeah, I think we're working like Planet. I'm sure we're working with partners to better understand how to harness those technologies and the models in the most effective way, which give the best outcomes. I think the thing is, it's about making, as always, making sure that the data that goes in is appropriate to the outcomes that you're finding with it, and making sure the patterns you see aren't spurious. Which again is a modeler's thing as well. So I don't think this is anything different, regardless of the approach. It's a fundamental need for the use of that type of data, and one that, yeah, I think just becomes increasingly important when you're then providing that information to stakeholders who need to trust the outcomes.
Thanks, Matthew. I know we're coming up on time, so I wanted to give just one last opportunity for any of our panelists, as you've listened to this discussion, if there's any key reflections that you wanted to share, and we'll be closing out in just a moment.
Hey, Lindsay, I might pick up on one of the questions, and I think Nate touched on it as well, about the convening role that Prepare and USAID can play, because, I mean, across all these presentations, there's a lot of potential synergy, right? And I think it would be helpful for USAID to think a little bit about that. But I will say that a lot of that's happening already. I mean, and I think there's been a sea change in this space over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of people really recognizing that that this is team ball. Like, you're not going to win or achieve much on your own. It's really about the strategic partnerships that share the same objectives and can bring something that you can't. So I would say that there's an appetite for that type of new partnerships, and anything USAID can do to facilitate would be welcome, because I think that is where the real impact is going to happen.
Thanks for that, Francis. And that is definitely top of mind for us, and I know for the State Department and Global Resilience Partnership. And every time we have a discussion on call to action, there are more and more ideas and opportunities for where we can help with those synergies, and collectively reaching the goals that we've set. And I appreciate your phrase on this is team ball. It's so true. I think I will take this opportunity now to just close us out, and remind those on the line that the Prepare call to action remains open for companies to respond with actions related to the integration of adaptation and resilience in their core business or investments. And so I know there was a really active chat and question and answer, and we did our best to respond to what we could, but please be in touch and reach out if this sparked interest for you. I want to thank our production team at ResilienceLinks, especially Clarissa Perkins and Shantice McCorkle. And I also want to thank Pallavi Sherkar and the team at the State Department that's co-leading the call to action with our team here at USAID, as well as Nate Matthews of GRP, and hope you can join us at some of the upcoming events that they are leading. And to all of our presenters, Mariah, Matthew, Francis, and Megan, both for your contributions today, as well as for the work that your companies are doing to engage in a really deep way on adaptation. We're grateful for your work. Thank you to our audience and for your interest in Prepare, and please stay tuned for additional opportunities to engage in the Prepare call to action throughout the year. Take care, everyone.